Hello everybody, I am Luca Sarti, a PhD candidate at the University of Naples L'Orientale, where I am carrying out a research project focusing on Irish fairy tales collected and retold in the new millennium. Last year, I had the pleasure to participate in the British Association for Irish Studies virtual conference with a presentation entitled Stay Home, Don't Go Out, Reading Fair, Brown and Trembling in the Time of COVID-19, later become an article in the Journal of Comparative Literature and Aesthetics. This year, I will talk about translating Irish fairy tales, the case of Una Leavy's The White Gander. How shall we spend the next 20 minutes together? After a brief introduction on Irish fairy tales, I'll introduce the O'Brien Book of Irish Fairy Tales and Legends, written by Una Leavy and illustrated by Susan Field, which includes The White Gander, a fairy tale that I have translated into Italian for the first time. Eventually, I will show some examples of translation focusing on Irish words and culture-bound terms. Let's start by saying something about Irish fairy tales. The reason why fairy tales are important to Irish people and culture can be found in the last decades of the 19th century, in the years of the Celtic Revival, defined by Gregory Castle as a complex and multifaceted movement comprising a variety of approaches to the representation of Irish culture. In the literary world, this movement is better known as the Irish Literary Revival, which can be defined as a literary renaissance in the name of folklore. Specifically, not only folklore had a pivotal role in literary works, such as many poems written by William Butler Yeats, but several folklorists and writers also started collecting Irish folk and fairy tales to show the richness of the Gaelic culture and past and preserve stories that would otherwise be lost. Notably, when I talk about Irish fairy tales, I don't refer just to tales of magic. More precisely, as Vito Carrassi argues in the Irish fairy tale a narrative tradition from the Middle Ages to Yeats and Stevens, the Irish fairy tale can be defined as a bridge between parallel worlds. It is a sort of neutral zone between the mythological world, the legendary world, and the historical world. To be more precise, we can say that Irish fairy tales involve the meeting of what belongs to the present and is considered definite or visible, and what belongs to the past and is considered indefinite or invisible, and therefore the meeting of human and fairies, and that of pagan heroes and gods as well. Indeed, the origin of the Irish fairies is uncertain. Some think they are the ancient gods of pagan Ireland, the Tuatha De Danann, while others believe they are fallen angels or spirits of nature. However, as Purgey Farrell highlights in his collection, whatever their origins, Irish fairies, also known as the She or the Good People, fill pages of Irish literature as well as enriching a wealth of oral tradition. Furthermore, as Steve Lally points out in his introduction to Irish fairy Gothic stories, the term fairies is an anglicization for something that cannot be defined. But one thing is certain: the fairies of Ireland are not the magical or elaborate fairies that we know from stories such as Cinderella or Peter Pan, nor are they the delicate sweet fairies we see in a Disney film. As I've said before, in the Victorian age, many writers collected Irish fairy tales, especially in the years of the Celtic Renaissance. An example is the collections by Thomas Crofton Croker, Lady Wilde, William Butler Yeats, Jeremiah Cotton, and Lady Gregory, to name a few. Since then, many fairy tale collections have been published throughout the 20th century. And they are still published today, 100 years later the publication of James Stevens' retellings. To mention some of the fairy tale books published in the last decades, we can find the works by Kathleen Kroll, who recently passed away, Michael Scott, Eddie Lenihan, Deirdre Sullivan, and Una Leavy. the author of the O'Brien Book of Irish Fairy Tales and Legends. The O'Brien Book of Irish Fairy Tales and Legends was published by the O'Brien Press in 1996 as a hardback and in 2011 as a paperback. On its back cover, we read, Irish fairy tales and legends are full of enchantment, brave deeds, and lost loves. Told from generation to generation, they are as fascinating now as they were to their original listeners. These tales are retold by Irish author Una Leavy, who works as a primary school teacher, and illustrated by Susan Field. Both of them have respectively written and illustrated several books for children. As for this book, it is a collection of 10 tales labeled as the best tales from the Irish tradition, such as How Cuchulainn got his name, The Giant's Causeway, The Pot of Gold, Tír na Nog, and The White Gander, which is the story that I have translated in the study. As can be read from the Something About the Stories section at the end of the book, which provides some information about the stories collected, this story is retold from several sources, including Legends from Ireland edited by Sean Sullivan, and taken from the Irish Folklore Archives. Another source is The Piper and the Pooka, a story translated literally from the Irish by Douglas Hyde and published for the first time in 1888 in Yeats' Fairy and Folk Tales of the Irish Peasantry. What is this story about? The White Gander tells the adventure of a lazy and foolish Irish guy called Seamus, who lives with his mother. Although he is a papa who can only play one tune, he is invited to every feast, and one Halloween night he is invited to play at a dance. After the dance, on his way back home, Seamus meets the Pooka, one of the fairies from the Irish folklore, who takes him to the fairy kingdom. There, where 100 dogs are having a feast, Seamus finds out that he can play several tunes, including one called The White Gander, and that music transforms the ugly old hags into beautiful young girls. In return, he receives gold coins, and the White Gander gives him new pipes, and in the end, he comes back home changed for the better. In this story, to use Karassi's terminology, the meeting between the definite and the indefinite happens when Seamus, a human being, meets the Pooka, a fairy. According to Yeats, the Pooka is an animal spirit having many shapes. For example, he can be a horse, a goat, or an eagle. He is a clever shapeshifter that speaks in the human voice and usually appears on November Day. As can be seen in these examples, he often appears in the form of a horse. Indeed, he is depicted as a horse in many literary fairy tales illustrations, such as those appearing in the collections by Croker, McAnally, and Lallis, and in the arts in general. An example is Jack Yeats' The Pooka, and Walt Disney Darby O'Gill and the Little People, the film adaptation of Hermione Kavanagh's books, and it is portrayed as a horse also in the fairy tale in analysis. Well, after this introductory part, now I will show you how I have translated some parts of this fairy tale into the Italian language, taking into account some notions and theories in the field of translation studies, a term coined by James Holmes in 1972, in the name and nature of translation studies, and employed to refer to translation as an academic discipline. In my study, in which I deal with a case of interlingual translation, namely translation from one language to another, I refer to translation as both a process and a product. As Basil Hatim and Jeremy Munday explain in Translation, an advanced research book, the first sense focuses on the role of the translator in taking the original or source text and turning it into text into another language, the target text, that is, from the source language to the target language in my case, while the second centers on the concrete translation product produced by the translator. Although translation studies during the years have been marked by several shifts, I will limit myself to citing only two because they are central to my research, namely the Scopus theory and the cultural turn. The former was theorized in 1984 by Katharina Ress and Hans Vermeer, who focused on the idea that translating should primarily consider the function of the target text produced in a target setting for a target purpose. The latter was theorized in 1990 by Susan Bassnett and André Lefebvre, who envisaged that neither the word nor the text but the culture is the operational unit of translation. To put it in the words of Hatim and Monday, cultural turn is a metaphor that has been adopted by cultural studies oriented translation theorists to refer to the analysis of translation in its cultural, political, and ideological context. In other words, it considers the relationship between translation and other disciplines, such as postcolonialism. Although initially a term referring only to former European colonies, in the field of translation studies, postcolonialism allows for the study of power relations between different groups or cultures, including a study of language, literature, and translation. In this case study, the relation taken into account is that between England and Ireland. As Michael Cronin argues in Translating Ireland, Translation, Languages, Cultures, which is an example of treating post-colonialism from a European point of view, Ireland's ambiguous position between Europe and the so-called New World and its long-standing status as a colony of England render it an exemplary site of translational difficulties. Since Ireland's official languages are English and Irish, we can find fairy tales of the Emerald Isle and Charlie written in English, in Irish, or multilingual, as happens in Yeats' anthology, which contains stories written in Irish English featuring many Irish words. Furthermore, considering the socio-historical context in which Irish fairy tales were transcribed and collected for the first times, it is not surprising that they and their retellings about in culture-bound terms or culture-specific items, namely words or concepts related to a specific culture. In a nutshell, we can say that literary Irish fairy tales are texts produced in what Omi Baba defines as third space, a space that, in this case, is created by the meeting and clash of the English and the Irish languages and cultures. For time constraints, in this presentation of the translation of the source text, the white gander, in the target text, l'oca bianca, I will only focus on some examples of translation of Irish words and culture-bound elements. Precisely as I've said before, I will show some examples of translation as a product, showing the Italian translations of chosen parts, and as a process, explaining which translation strategies I have employed, such as those theorized by Paul Newmark, Lawrence Venuti, Gideon Turi, and Joseph Malone, the latter adopted by Christopher Taylor in Language to Language, a practical and theoretical guide for Italian English translators. The first examples regards the very beginning of the story, when Leavy introduces its protagonist, Shemas. As you can see, instead of translating this Irish personal name, which represents a culture-specific item, into Italian, or adapting it in its anglicized form, Seamus, I have decided to adopt Venuti's foreignization strategy, leaving Shemas untranslated, in order to preserve its foreignness and the information of the source text that highlights the Irishness of the story. In addition, in order not to hinder the readability of the text to Italian children and their parents or teachers, employing Malone's amplification strategy, I have added I have added a footnote with the pronunciation of the name and its Italian equivalent Giacomo. Curiously, the pronunciation reminds the Italian word scemo, which translates as silly, foolish, a coincidence that comes to be indicative of one of the characteristics of the main character of the story. Furthermore, this is also an example of what Turi has defined as adequate translation, since it follows the linguistic norms of the source text, although the whole target text represents a case of target-oriented translation, since it primarily takes into account the demand of the target reader. Eventually, this is also an example of borrowing, considered the simplest of all translation methods, since the original name is copied and changed in the target text. In the second tab, we can find an example of Newmark's recognized translation strategy, when I translate Ilian pipes in the accepted Italian translation cornamusa irlandese. As the author explains in the Something About the Story section of the book, the Ilian pipes were commonly played in Ireland. They were played with the elbow, the Gaelic word for elbow being Ilian. The third example focuses on a case of chord mixing. Before Seamus leaves the house to go to play at the Halloween dance in the next valley, his mother gives him some advice and calls him agro, here by me pronounced according to the Ulster dialect simply because I find it easier to pronounce. According to O'Donnell Irish English Dictionary, folklore Gaelic Burla, first published in 1977, agro Agro translates as my love, my dear. Therefore, I have decided to translate it into the Italian language as tesoro mio, which means my darling, this time opting for an accepted translation to say it by using tourist terminology. Eventually, in the case of the word puka, in the story spelled in its Irish form, I have decided once again to employ the borrowing strategy, given that there is not an Italian equivalent as happens for other Irish fairy creatures such as the leprechaun. Meaningfully, I decided to leave it in its Irish form instead of choosing its anglicized form, which is more prevalent, both to keep the diversity offered in the source text and because it is orthographically and phonologically closer to the Italian language. Besides, this time I didn't have to add a footnote to clarify the meaning of the culture-bound term since it is explained in the text when the word puka appears for the first time. The puka was a spirit that was said to roam on Halloween night. It was thought to be something halfway between a horse and a goat, as you can see from Susan Field's beautiful illustration, where the puka is depicted as a horse with two goat curling horns on its head. In conclusion, with these examples of translation into the Italian language, I hope I gave an example of why Ireland is considered a site of translational difficulties. And I hope that I shed light on how difficult can be to translate Irish fairy tales for an Italian-speaking readership to spread Irish stories and culture while dealing with cases of multilingualism and culture-bound terms. By adopting several translation strategies, I tried to balance my translation in order to offer a readable text for the target audience while trying to keep at the same time the Irishness highlighted in the original text. Thank you all for your kind attention.